The call came on a Thursday morning in early November, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, while I was standing at my kitchen sink washing my coffee mug and watching a pair of cardinals argue over the bird feeder Harold had built the summer before he died. I had 12 pounds of cranberries sorted in the refrigerator, a 22-pound turkey defrosting in the garage, and a handwritten menu card on the fridge that I'd been revising since the second week of October. That's how I've always done things. My mother was the same way. Some people think early planning is a form of anxiety, but she always said it was a form of respect for the people you were about to feed. Marcus's name lit up my phone screen. I answered on the second ring the way I always did when family called. 11 years of him being my daughter's husband had trained me to pick up without hesitating, to treat his calls with the same priority as Claire's as the grandchildren's. The habit of reaching for the phone before I'd thought about it was one of many small accommodations I'd made over the years without ever stopping to measure what they cost. "Hey Mom," he said. There was a flatness in his voice that always managed to sound both casual and deliberate. In all 11 years of his marriage to Claire, Marcus Webb had never once called me Ruth, which is my name, or Mrs. Calloway, which would have been formal but honest. It was always Mom, delivered in a tone that contained none of the word's actual meaning. I asked about Claire, about the kids, whether Lily had gotten over the cold she'd had the week before. He answered in short sentences. "Fine. Better. Yeah." Then came a pause that wasn't the pause of someone gathering their thoughts, but of someone who had already decided what they were about to say. "So listen," he said, "about Thanksgiving. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. My name is Ruth Calloway, and I am 69 years old. I spent 34 years as the head librarian at the Fairview Public Library in Fairview, Connecticut, a town of about 22,000 people 40 minutes north of Hartford. Before that, I worked the reference desk at the county library while taking night classes to finish my master's degree, commuting 40 minutes each way in a car with a clutch that needed replacing for 2 years before I could afford to replace it. I married Harold Calloway in June of 1979 in the backyard of my parents' house, a ceremony attended by 47 people because that's all we could fit comfortably, and we had chosen comfort over impressiveness from the very beginning. He wore a light gray suit bought on clearance at Macy's. I wore my grandmother's pearl earrings and a dress I'd made myself from a simplicity pattern, ivory cotton eyelet that took 3 weeks and 2 failed attempts to get right. We ate sheet cake from Stop and Shop and drank champagne from plastic flutes, and it was the happiest day of my life up to that point. Harold was a civil engineer. He spent his career with the Connecticut Department of Transportation designing and overseeing the construction of bridges, the kind of infrastructure people cross every day without once thinking about who made sure it would hold. He was meticulous, methodical, and patient in everything he did. When our granddaughter Lily was 8 years old and asked him what he did for work, he thought about it and said, "I make sure things hold up." She considered that for a moment and said, "That's the most important job." He carried that answer for the rest of his life. Was still telling the story the week before he died. We were not wealthy people and we never tried to be. We owned our house in Fairview outright after 20 years of paying it down, a 4-bedroom colonial on half an acre with a vegetable garden I've tended for 3 decades and a garage Harold converted into a woodworking shop when the boys in the neighborhood stopped needing it for bikes. We drove cars until they stopped running. We took one vacation a year, almost always to the same rental cottage on the Maine coast in August, chosen for its reliability rather than novelty. We replaced things when they wore out. We did not replace things simply because newer ones existed. What we did do was save. Harold was consistent about it in the way that people who grew up with very little tend to be consistent about things that represent security. He maxed out his retirement contributions every year from the time the amounts were meaningful. He bought whole life insurance in his 40s when the premiums were still manageable. He invested modestly and conservatively in index funds through a Vanguard account he'd opened in 1994 and almost never touched. He never spoke about any of this. Our generation didn't talk about money. You made it, you saved it, you didn't display it, and you didn't burden other people with the numbers. Harold died 3 years ago this past September. A stroke sudden at 68 years old. He was in the woodworking shop on a Saturday morning, building a rocking chair he'd promised to make for our grandson James. I found him when I brought out a glass of iced tea at 11 o'clock. The paramedic said he'd been gone for at least an hour. I sat in the garden for the rest of that afternoon and didn't go inside until our neighbor Helen came to check on me at 4. The estate took 8 months to fully settle. My attorney, Patricia Higgins, was patient and thorough, and had to explain certain figures to me more than once because grief does something to the way numbers move through the mind. When the complete picture finally assembled itself, it looked like this: life insurance policies totaling $940,000. Harold's retirement accounts, rolled into accounts in my name, came to approximately $780,000. An investment account held $420,000 at the time of settlement, though it has grown since. And then there was a matter I hadn't anticipated. Harold had a former business partner and college roommate named Robert Finch, his closest friend from their 20s, who had included Harold as a silent investor in a small technology company years before I had any knowledge of the arrangement. I'd heard Harold mention Robert's new venture once early on, in the way husbands mention things at dinner when the day has been long and they're not really expecting you to file it. I hadn't filed it. That company was acquired by a larger firm 14 months after Harold died, and my share of the settlement came to $1.4 million. I hadn't known it was coming. When Patricia laid out the number, I sat across from her desk and couldn't speak for a full minute. When I finally found my voice, I cried for the better part of 20 minutes, not because the money overwhelmed me, but because I understood for the first time the full scale of what Harold had been building all those quiet years. Every decision, every deferred indulgence, every contribution maxed out and account left untouched. He had spent his life making sure things held up, making sure I would hold up after he was gone, when he couldn't be there to do it himself. My liquid assets total approximately $3.5 million, not including the house. Patricia established a trust, set up the accounts with proper security and beneficiary designations, and then sat forward in her chair and said something I've thought about many times since: Eleanor. She always called me Eleanor. Nobody has ever done that, and I never corrected her because it seemed to come from a place of genuine care. The people who would want to know this number are exactly the people you should not tell. She recommended I keep these matters private. Not from any sinister reasoning on her part, but because she had watched money change family relationships too many times to count, and she liked me and didn't want to watch it happen to me. I took her advice. My daughter Claire knows Harold left me well provided for. She can see that I don't worry about bills, that I'm generous with the grandchildren at Christmas, that I'm able to offer help when help is needed. She does not know the full numbers. I have never told her, and I have never told Marcus. That decision, made 3 years ago in Patricia's office on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, is the reason the story I'm about to tell you unfolded the way it did. The 3 years since Harold died have had a particular quality that I haven't been able to name precisely. Not unbearable, not empty, not even lonely in the way I'd expected. I still had my library 2 afternoons a week, still had my garden through the growing season, still had Helen next door, still had the phone calls with Claire and the visits with Lily and James. I had built a life within the loss rather than around it. The hardest part was not the big occasions, the holidays and anniversaries and birthdays, where grief has a kind of permission to exist and people expect you to feel it. The hardest part was the Tuesday afternoons and the Sunday mornings and the evenings in late October when the light changes in that particular way Harold always liked. The moments when you reach for the habit of sharing something with someone and find only the space where they used to be. A bird I'd noticed on the feeder. A chapter in a book I thought he'd enjoy. Something Lily said that was so exactly right and funny that I wanted to turn and repeat it to someone who loved her the same way I did. Those small impulses with nowhere to go. I got used to them the way you get used to most things, slowly, and without ever fully getting used to them. What I did not do in those 3 years was ask for help. Not because I was proud, though I suppose I am, but because asking for help had never been my instinct. I had spent my adult life being the person other people leaned on, and that role is surprisingly hard to set down even when you need to. When Lily asked me once, very directly in the way only children and very old people are, "Grandma, are you lonely?" I told her I had a full life, which was true and also not the same as saying no. Claire was our only child. We'd wanted more but it didn't happen, and we made peace with that and gave her everything we had in the way that's different from spoiling, the way that actually costs you something and changes you as you give it. We raised her to work hard and tell the truth and pay attention to the people around her. She was a genuinely warm child. The kind who noticed when someone was struggling and went to sit beside them without being told. She had Harold's patience and, I like to think some of my stubbornness, which I prefer to think of as persistence. She became a dental hygienist, good at the work, though she only manages 2 days a week now since Lily and James came along, and Marcus earns enough that her full income isn't necessary. At 42 she still has that core warmth, that perceptiveness, though she has learned over the years to soften those perceptions when they point toward friction at home. Watching that happen, the gradual smoothing of her edges in the direction of Marcus's preferences, was one of the quieter griefs of the past decade. The kind of loss that has no funeral and no name. She met Marcus at a work event 11 years ago. He arrived 45 minutes late, she told me afterward, and had apologized with the practiced ease of someone for whom charm is a professional habit rather than a personal quality. He was handsome in a polished way, the kind of handsomeness that comes less from features and more from consistent maintenance. Good clothes, regular haircuts, clean shoes, the posture of someone who has decided they belong in whatever room they've entered. He ran his own marketing consultancy, Webb and Associates, which he described as boutique and growing in the same breath. He spoke about his work with the enthusiasm of someone who either loves what they do, or has learned to perform that love convincingly. I liked him well enough at the start. He was charming in the way of people who are skilled at reading rooms, who notice what a person responds to and then give more of it. With me, in those early months, he asked intelligent questions about Harold's engineering work, laughed genuinely at Harold's dry humor, complimented my cooking with specific observations rather than easy generalities. He called me Mrs. Calloway until I told him Ruth was fine, and then at some point I can't precisely locate now, Mrs. Calloway became Mom, and I didn't catch the transition until it was already established. Harold liked him less than I did. He never said so directly, Harold wasn't that way, but I knew him for 40 years and I knew the quality of his silences. The way he would get up to refill his coffee cup when conversation turned to Marcus's business plans or his opinions on various subjects. The physical act of withdrawal that said more than anything he would have put into words. Near the end of his life, Harold said one thing to me about Marcus that I have returned to many times in the years since. We were sitting on the back porch one evening, and I'd been telling him about a visit I'd made to Claire's house that week, a visit during which Marcus had spent most of the afternoon in his home office, and Lily had whispered to me while we worked a puzzle together, "Grandma, Daddy says you come too much." I'd laughed it off for Lily's sake, but I told Harold that evening, and he was quiet for a moment, looking out at the yard, and then he said, "Ruth, some people receive generosity as though it were their right. They're the hardest kind to deal with because they're never grateful, never satisfied, and they never see the transaction for what it is. Just pay attention." Then he went back to whatever book was open in his lap, and we never returned to the subject, and I wish now that we had returned to it many times. I thought about those words often in the years after Harold died. I thought about them especially when I was writing checks. The financial arrangements between Marcus and me developed the way many things develop in families. Gradually, without explicit agreement, through a series of individual decisions that each made sense in the moment and only revealed their shape looking backward. The first ones were small. I covered a dinner out because I'd suggested the expensive restaurant and it seemed right. I bought the grandchildren's school supplies one September because I happened to be with Lily when she was making the list. I paid the deposit on a Cape Cod rental because I'd pushed for us to return to the same house, and Marcus mentioned the price had increased and wasn't sure they could swing it that year. By the third year after Harold's death, a loose but real expectation had settled in. I paid for the family vacation each summer in full. A week in the Outer Banks the previous year at $3,800. A long weekend at a Vermont ski resort the year before that at $2,200. I covered Lily's private flute lessons when her teacher, the excellent one with the long waiting list, charged more than Marcus said they could budget for. I bought James's birthday bicycle the spring he turned 8 because Claire mentioned offhandedly that he'd been asking for one, and when I asked what it cost the number was higher than I'd expected, and I'd placed the order before properly thinking it through. I covered the gap when their water heater failed in February, and the repair landed in a difficult month for Marcus's business. None of these things were requested directly, and I want to be clear about that because it matters to understanding what this story is actually about. Marcus was not the kind of man who asked. He was the kind who mentioned, who described the constraint, the timing problem, the budget that didn't quite work, who let the silence after the description do the asking, and who never acknowledged the asking once it had been answered. I, who have spent my adult life paying attention to what people need and finding ways to meet it, Responded to the cues the way I'd always responded to cues. Because that is how I was made and what I did. Claire thanked me every time, specifically and genuinely, and I could see in her eyes both gratitude and something else, a discomfort she didn't know what to do with. She knew it wasn't entirely right. She didn't know how to stop it. She occupied the position of a woman who loves two people who don't quite love each other, and she managed it the way people in that position tend to manage it, by keeping both sides just comfortable enough to stay at the table. In September of this year, I did the largest single thing I'd ever done for them. I booked a Mediterranean cruise. It had started as a birthday idea. I turned 70 in January, which felt like something worth marking, and Harold and I had talked about the Mediterranean for years without ever going, always finding a reason to wait for a better time that never quite came. After he died, the idea of traveling anywhere beautiful felt for a long while more painful than staying home. A beautiful place without Harold in it seemed like the wrong kind of proof of his absence. But 3 years is long enough to grieve a future you'd planned together. And I'd been watching Lily study ancient Rome in school that fall, reporting facts about the Colosseum at dinner with the breathless authority of an 11-year-old expert. And one September afternoon I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and opened a travel website. The first time I'd opened a travel website since Harold died. I noticed that. I sat with it for a moment before I started reading. I found a 14-night cruise on a mid-luxury line, departing Rome and ending in Athens, 7 ports of call including Dubrovnik, Santorini, and Mykonos. 2 connecting balcony cabins on the 8th deck, 1 for me and 1 for Claire and Marcus, with a pull-out sofa for the children. I called Donna, the travel agent I'd used twice before for smaller trips, and asked her to walk me through the pricing. The total for 5 passengers, both cabins, gratuities, and the full shore excursion package came to $82,400. The deposit to hold the reservation was $16,500, due immediately. The balance of $65,900 was due December 1st. I sat with those numbers for 2 days, not because I couldn't afford it, but because it was a significant sum and I wanted to be certain before I committed. I thought about Harold, about the trip we'd always said we'd take. I thought about Lily's face when she found out. I thought about James, who was 9 now and would remember this for the rest of his life. I called Donna back on the 3rd day and told her to book it. I charged the deposit to my Visa and paid the card balance the same afternoon. I told Claire about it on a Sunday phone call, keeping it general. I said I'd been thinking about a Mediterranean trip for my birthday, and was considering something really special. All 5 of us together. She went quiet for a moment and then said, "Mom, seriously?" in the voice she uses when something genuinely moves her. I told her it was a cruise, 14 nights, late March departure. She asked once about the cost half-heartedly, in the way that signals a person doesn't quite want to know, and I said don't worry about it in a tone she accepted because she trusted me and because I think she'd learn not to look too closely at the things that came from me. She told Marcus. He texted me 2 days later. "Claire told me about the trip. That's incredibly generous of you, Mom. The kids are going to lose their minds." He included a smiley face emoji, the first time he had ever used one with me, which told me exactly how pleased he was. He mentioned the cruise to his colleagues. I know this because Lily told me, with the thorough casualness of a 12-year-old who reports the world as she observes it, that Daddy told his work friends we're going on a cruise for your birthday. He talked about it at his golf game. He described it at a dinner party the Webbs attended in October, which I know because Claire mentioned it the following week, slightly embarrassed by the mention. The trip had become, without my designing it this way, a piece of his social currency. A story he could tell about himself and the life he was building and the family he came from. My birthday. My money. His story. All of that was September and October. By November it was the phone call. "So listen," Marcus said after fine and better and yeah. "About Thanksgiving. We're going to do something a little different this year." I waited. "We're going to keep it quiet. Just the immediate family. Just us. Claire and me and the kids. It's been a really busy fall for everyone. And Claire is exhausted, and honestly I think we all just need a low-key holiday. You know how it gets." I didn't respond immediately. Something in me went very still. "We love you, obviously," he continued. The word obviously landed somewhere specific in my chest. "It's just this year we need the downtime. I hope you understand." "Of course," I said. My voice came out smooth and even, which surprised me. Of course I understand. He exhaled, the exhale of someone who had prepared for more resistance. Thanks, Mom. I knew you'd get it. You always do. We said goodbye and I stood at the kitchen sink looking out at the bird feeder. The cardinals were gone. The yard was quiet. 12 pounds of cranberries in the refrigerator. A turkey in the garage. A menu card on the fridge that I'd been revising since the second week of October. I thought about calling Claire immediately. I decided to wait. The full picture arrived 3 days later in the form of a text from my granddaughter. Lily and I have had a private texting thread for 2 years. She started it at 10 years old because she wanted to tell me things without the notification appearing on her parents' phones, which tells you something in retrospect about the kind of household she was navigating at that age. She'd send me pictures of things she found funny at school, questions about books she was reading, updates on how the flute was going. I'd send back terrible puns and book recommendations and occasional photographs of something interesting in the garden. It was ours, that thread. Small and real and undiscussed with anyone else. Lily was the child most like Harold in her way of being in the world. Observant, not in a suspicious way but in the way of someone who genuinely notices things and then considers what they mean. She was 12 and already more emotionally intelligent than most adults I knew. She made me feel, in the way certain people make you feel, that being around her was a specific kind of gift. On the Sunday 3 days after the Thursday call, Lily sent me a screenshot. It was Claire's Instagram story, posted and deleted within an hour. The brief online moment that 12-year-olds catch before adults fully register they've put it up. The image showed the dining room table at Claire and Marcus's house, set for 8, with small paper pilgrim hats that Marcus's mother made every November arranged at each place setting. Corn centerpieces from the farmer's market. The caption read, "Getting ready for the whole crew. So grateful for family." 8 settings. Marcus's parents were coming. His brother Derek and Derek's wife Shelley. Everyone. The whole Webb family. Gathered for a holiday I had spent 49 years celebrating with my own. Lily's text said, "Grandma, I didn't know you weren't coming until Dad said something to Mom this morning and I heard them. Thought you were sick or something. Are you okay?" I told her I was fine. I told her we would see each other very soon and not to worry. I said I loved her and asked her not to mention this conversation to her parents, because I didn't want her caught in the middle of anything. She sent back a heart emoji and then, after a minute, a second message. "I miss you, Grandma," with the small face that reads as something between sad and uncertain. I set the phone down on the table and sat with what I was feeling. I want to be accurate about those days, because this story is useful only if it's honest. The feelings weren't clean or sorted. I was not immediately and righteously certain about what to do. What I felt was something closer to a physical weight in my chest, a heaviness that didn't lift when I stood up or went out to the garden or made myself eat dinner at the table instead of standing at the counter the way you do when you're eating to keep going rather than because you're hungry. I had been excluded, deliberately and specifically, from a holiday I had celebrated for 49 years with my family. My daughter had let this happen. My grandchildren were going to sit around a table with 8 place settings and understand, in whatever way children understand these things, that Grandma wasn't there this year. And on December 1st, $65,900 was due to a cruise line for a vacation Marcus had been describing to his colleagues for 2 months. I called Helen on Monday afternoon. Helen is 71, has known me since Lily was in preschool, and has the quality I value most in a friend. She tells you what she thinks without building a case around it or softening it until it means something different. I told her everything. The call from Marcus. The Instagram story. Lily's text. The cruise and what it cost. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Ruth," she said. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know yet." "Yes, you do. You called me because you've already made the decision and you want to say it out loud before you act on it." I was quiet. "You're going to cancel the trip," she said. "He doesn't deserve to go on that trip." "No," she agreed. "He doesn't." And Claire went along with it. She could have pushed back. She could have at minimum called me. She did neither. Claire's in a difficult position. I know she is. I'm not angry with Claire the way I'm angry with Marcus. But she's not a child, Helen. She made a choice. Helen said, "What about the deposit? You'll lose some of it." "I'll lose the cancellation fee, $2,000. I'll get back 14,500. So it's not about the money. It's not about the money, I said. Then what is it? I thought about how to say it clearly. He excluded me from Thanksgiving. Claire went along with it. And then on December 1st they were going to take $82,000 of my money to the Mediterranean. And none of them not once saw anything inconsistent in that. Helen didn't say anything for a moment. Then, when are you going to call Donna? I'm giving myself 5 days, I said. I want to make sure I'm deciding from the right place. What's the wrong place? Anger, I said. I don't want to do this because I'm angry. I want to do it because it's right. She said, let me know. I gave myself 5 days and I used them honestly. I didn't call Claire or Marcus. I went to the library on Tuesday and Wednesday, tended the last of the autumn garden, cooked real meals, read in the evenings. Every morning I woke up and the decision was still there, unchanged, waiting. I thought about the phone call, about that practice pause before the Thanksgiving announcement, about I knew you'd get it, you always do. I thought about Lily's text and the 8 place settings and Marcus at his golf game describing the birthday cruise to men who would nod and think well of him for having a mother-in-law who did things like this. I also thought about Harold's voice saying some people receive generosity as though it were their right. I'd heard those words for 3 years and understood them as a warning about something to watch for. I wondered what he'd say now, looking at the pattern those years had assembled. I thought he'd say something like, "You've been paying attention, Ruth. Now do something with what you've seen." On Thursday evening of those 5 days, I went through my bank statements for the past 3 years. I don't know exactly why I chose that evening. I hadn't planned it. The folder was in the filing cabinet where I keep everything organized, and I pulled it out and sat at the kitchen table under the overhead light and went through the pages. Not adding things up exactly, but reading them the way you read a long letter from someone, looking for the story in the individual lines. The vacation deposits. The school supplies receipt. The flute teacher, $45 a week, 46 weeks the first year, 46 the second. The bicycle. The water heater. The birthday dinners where I'd said I'd like to take everyone out, and then paid the bill without discussion because that was how it went. I put the folder back in the cabinet and made chamomile tea and sat with it until it was cold. I wasn't doing arithmetic. I was being honest with myself about what the past 3 years had looked like from the outside. If there had been anyone watching from the outside. Harold had been right and I had known he was right and I had kept the door open anyway because Claire was in there and so were Lily and James, and some doors you keep open for the people behind them even when the person answering is someone else entirely. By Friday the decision had stopped moving. It wasn't anger. It was something much steadier than anger and much more settled. I called Donna at 3:15 in the afternoon. She answered on the second ring. "Ruth, I was just looking at your March reservation." "Donna?" I said. "I need to cancel. Both cabins. Everything." She asked if something had happened. I told her there had been a change in plans and I'd like to proceed with the cancellation under the terms we discussed when I booked. She confirmed the cancellation fee, confirmed the refund timeline, confirmed the amount I'd receive back. We were on the phone for 11 minutes. By the time we hung up, the reservation was gone and $14,500 would be returned to my Visa within 7 to 10 business days. I made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table. The cruise being cancelled was not the end of this story. It was the beginning of it. The call I hadn't yet made to Claire was the one that would set everything in motion that I want to tell you about. Before I made that call, I needed to be clear about what I was doing and what I was prepared to accept as a consequence. I wasn't doing this to punish Marcus, though I would be dishonest if I claimed there was no element of consequence in it. What I was doing was stopping a pattern, the one that had developed over years of small accommodations and silent, unacknowledged transactions, the one in which I was expected to be endlessly generous and endlessly peripheral, to fund things and to fade from them, to write checks and disappear at Thanksgiving. 69 years is a long time to be a person. I had raised Claire with everything I had. I had been Harold's wife for 40 years. I had worked 34 years at a job I believed in and would choose again. I had grieved Harold's death with a completeness I couldn't have prepared for, and still haven't fully recovered from. I had built a life and it was mine and it was good, and I was not going to spend the remainder of it being generous toward people who had decided I was not really family. I picked up the phone and called Claire. She answered on the third ring, slightly breathless, the sound of someone in the middle of something. Mom. Hi. Is everything okay? Everything's fine, I said. I just need to tell you something about the cruise. A short pause. Oh, she said. I canceled it, I said. Both cabins. This afternoon. The silence that followed was different from any silence I'd heard from Claire in a very long time. Mom, she finally said. Her voice had changed entirely. Mom, what happened? I found out that Thanksgiving this year isn't quiet family time. It's the whole Webb family. Your in-laws, Derek and Shelley. 8 place settings at the table. Lily sent me a screenshot of your Instagram story before you deleted it. She said nothing. I've thought about it for 5 days, I continued. I wanted to make sure I wasn't deciding from anger. I don't think I am. Marcus told me I wasn't part of your immediate family. I took him at his word and made some adjustments. Mom. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I should have told you. When Marcus said we were doing it differently this year, I should have pushed back, and when I didn't push back, I should have at least called you. I did neither of those things. Why not? She took a breath. Because I knew how it was going to look. And I didn't know what to do with that. How did it look to you, Claire? She didn't answer immediately. Like he was deciding who belonged, I said. And I didn't make the list. Mom, his parents are coming. His brother and Shelley. Every member of his family. At the table in a house where I have celebrated Thanksgiving for 23 years. I have a turkey in my garage and 12 pounds of cranberries in my refrigerator. I bought them 3 weeks ago when Marcus called and sounded like he was calling to confirm the arrangements. She made a sound, something between a gasp and something swallowed back. I'm not saying this to wound you, I said. I'm saying it so you understand my thinking. $65,900 was due on December 1st for that cruise. I booked it as a birthday gift to myself and to all of you. And your husband told me, in the clearest way he knew how, that I am not really part of your family. I thought it was appropriate to reconsider. He didn't mean it that way. What way did he mean it? She was quiet. He said the kids were stressed with school. That you'd understand. That you'd understand. The same phrase he'd used with me on the phone. He had told Claire I would understand before she'd even raised the concern, had answered her objection before she could fully voice it, because he knew from 11 years of marriage to my daughter that Ruth always understands. Ruth is easy that way. I've understood a great many things over the years, I said. I understood when he forgot my birthday 2 years running. I understood when Thanksgiving moved to his parents' house for 3 years, and I was invited as something between an afterthought and an obligation. I have understood, Claire, more than I should have been asked to. I'm not sure I want to understand this one. She started crying, not loudly but steadily, the kind of crying that happens when something you've been holding finds a small opening. I felt the pull of it. The reflex to comfort her, to smooth it over, to say it was all right, that I'd call Donna back, that we'd find a way to fix it. The reflex that had brought me here. I didn't follow it. Can you rebook? She asked when she could speak. Can you call Donna and see if the cabins are still available? No, I said. Mom. No. I made this decision carefully. I'm not going to undo it. The kids are going to be heartbroken. Lily has been looking up restaurants in Rome every day since September. She made a whole list. This landed. I won't pretend it didn't. Lily's face finding out. The particular 12-year-old version of disappointment that carries all the weight of the adult version but none of the armor. Lily can come stay with me at Christmas, I said. We'll plan something together, just the two of us. She'll be all right. And Marcus, Claire said. Her voice had gone flat now. What am I supposed to tell Marcus? That's between you and Marcus. He's going to be furious. That's between you and Marcus, I said again. We were both quiet for a moment. I love you, Claire, I said. That is not in question. But I need you to hear something. I have spent a long time accommodating and adjusting and telling myself I was being too sensitive. Since your father died, I've written more checks and swallowed more indignities than I can accurately count. And each time I told myself it was the right thing to do for the sake of everyone's comfort, including yours. I am not going to do that indefinitely. I wanted you to know that. She said very quietly, I'm sorry, Mom. I know you are, I said. Good night. I hung up and sat at the table with my tea, which had gone cold. The kitchen was dim, just the light over the stove. I got up and turned on the overhead light and stood in the kitchen I've stood in 10,000 times. In the house Harold and I bought in 1982 for $94,000 with a down payment we'd saved for 6 years. The house where we raised Claire, where Harold built his woodworking shop, where I've tended the same garden for 30 years and know every corner of it, the way you know the face of someone you have loved for a long time. I thought about Harold, about what he would have done in my position. He would have made the decision and let the results speak, I thought. He would not have needed anyone's approval before acting. He would have known that some things have to be stopped before something better can begin. Marcus called at 8:17 that evening. I know the time because I looked at the clock when his name appeared on the screen. I let it ring 3 times. Then I answered. Ruth. He hadn't called me Ruth in 11 years. The warmth was completely gone from his voice, the practiced ease set aside now that it had stopped serving a purpose. Marcus, I said. Claire told me what you did. His voice had the controlled quality of someone working hard at the control. She told me you canceled the cruise. That's right. Do you want to explain to me why you did that? The entitlement in the question, the assumption that he was owed an explanation for a decision I made about my own money, steadied me in a way I hadn't anticipated. I felt very clear. I'd be happy to explain, I said. You called me on November 8th and told me Thanksgiving this year would be a quiet family holiday, just the immediate family. You used that phrase specifically. You said there was no room for extended family. He was silent. 3 days later, Lily sent me a screenshot of your wife's Instagram story before she deleted it. Your parents are coming. Your brother and his wife. Every member of your family. I appear to be the only person who was excluded. That's not the same, Marcus. You gathered your entire family for a holiday at my daughter's house, a house where I have spent 23 Thanksgivings, and you told me there was no room for me. It wasn't about room, Ruth, it was about who you consider family, I said. I've received a clear answer to that question. I thought it was appropriate to make some adjustments accordingly. The silence shifted. Something underneath the controlled anger moved into something that might have been alarm. $82,000, he said. That trip cost $82,000. He knew the full price. He had looked it up, or Claire had forwarded him the booking confirmation, or he'd done his own arithmetic based on what she'd told him. He knew the number and had been sitting with it since September, telling his colleagues about the birthday cruise, describing the Mediterranean itinerary, using it as a piece of the story he told about his life. And still, I lost a cancellation fee, I said. Otherwise, I'll receive a full refund. You can't do this. His voice cracked slightly, the control beginning to fail at the edges. You can't cancel an $80,000 trip over a holiday dinner. You're punishing the children. You're hurting Lily over something that has nothing to do with her. I'm not punishing the kids, I said. I'll see Lily and James at Christmas and I'll do something special with them. What I'm choosing not to do is fund a vacation for a family gathering that doesn't include me as a member of the family. You're being ridiculous. I'm being consistent, I said. You told me who I am in this family. I'm taking you at your word. He tried several more arguments. He said Claire was devastated. He said I was making things harder than they needed to be. He said he'd been under enormous pressure, and the Thanksgiving decision had nothing to do with how he truly felt about me. He said the kids would never forgive me for this, which was the sharpest thing he said all night, designed precisely to make me back down, and which, I noticed with some surprise, did not work the way it once might have. Marcus, I said when he'd run through everything he had. I've listened to what you have to say. I want to tell you one thing in return, and I'd like you to hear it before we end this call. He was quiet. I have been generous with you and your family for 11 years. Not because I was obligated and not because I failed to notice what was happening, but because I loved my daughter and my grandchildren and because I am a person who takes care of people. I'm not asking for gratitude for any of it. What I am asking going forward is to be treated as a person worth basic respect. Not as a resource. Not as someone whose feelings are irrelevant as long as the check's clear. As a person. That's all. He didn't say anything. Good night, I said. I hung up. My hand was steady on the phone. I made a fresh cup of tea and sat at the table until 10 o'clock, then went upstairs to bed. I slept better than I had in weeks, not because anything was resolved, because nothing had been resolved at all, but because I had stopped waiting for something I was never going to receive. What I didn't know that night, sitting in my kitchen with my tea, was how much was still below the surface. I knew about the Thanksgiving dinner and what it meant. I knew about the years of financial arrangements and how they developed. I knew my own decision and why I'd made it. What I didn't know was what Marcus's financial situation actually looked like beneath the BMW and the country club conversations and the boutique and growing consultancy he'd been describing to people for years. What I didn't know was what Claire was about to find out late that same night, when Marcus slammed into his home office and she sat down at the kitchen table and opened a folder of household finances she had been putting off looking at for months. Some things surface when they're ready. Some things surface when they're forced. Sometimes the act of one person deciding that enough is enough creates a pressure that pushes everything else up into the light. Things that have been sitting in the dark for far longer than anyone realized. I had no way of knowing on that Friday night in November that the decision I'd made that afternoon was the first move in something that would involve lawyers and family meetings and revelations about money and a conversation with Claire that would last 3 hours and leave us both changed. I had no way of knowing that Marcus, who had seemed so firmly in control of the story of his own life, had been building that story on a foundation that would not, as Harold would have said, hold up. What I knew that night was simpler and enough for the moment. A woman 69 years old, who had spent a lifetime being generous and easy to overlook, had decided on a November Friday that enough was enough. That she was not going to pay for a cruise to the Mediterranean for a family that had told her, in its way, that she wasn't really family. That she was not nobody. She was Ruth Calloway. And she was, for the first time in longer than she could precisely name, going to act like it. Claire didn't sleep that night either. I didn't know this until she told me weeks later, but I suspected it at the time, the way you suspect things about your children across distances, some residue of 42 years of paying attention to them. She told me that after my call, after Marcus slammed his office door hard enough to rattle the framed print in the hallway, she sat at the kitchen table for a long time and didn't do anything at all. Just sat there in the quiet house, the kids asleep upstairs, the television going in Marcus's office with its particular late-night murmur of financial news, and she thought about a lot of things. About the 8 play settings she'd been arranging when she thought I had no idea they were coming. About the look on Lily's face that morning when Marcus had said something at breakfast about the cruise being cancelled. The way Lily had gone quiet in the specific way she goes quiet when she is absorbing something that doesn't make sense to her. About me. Standing in my kitchen alone on a Friday night with 12 pounds of cranberries in the refrigerator. Then she opened the folder. It had been sitting in the second drawer of the kitchen desk for 4 months. She'd put it there in July when the credit card statement came, and she glanced at the balance and then felt a sensation she described to me later as, like stepping on something you don't want to identify in bare feet. She'd put the statement in the folder and closed the drawer and told herself she'd deal with it when things calmed down. Which is the thing people tell themselves when what they mean is they're not ready to deal with it yet. Things had not calmed down. The folder had grown. She'd put things in it the way you put things in a drawer when the counter is getting crowded, without looking too carefully at what you're adding. Statements. Notices. A letter from the business bank that had the phrase account review required in the subject line, which she'd seen and not opened because the phrase contained a quality she recognized as bad news, and she'd learned somewhere along the way to delay bad news when possible. She opened everything that Friday night. It took her until almost 2 in the morning to go through it all. Not because the paperwork was complicated, but because her mind kept stopping and needing to restart. The credit cards first. 3 of them, all in Marcus's name, all carrying balances she hadn't known about. $41,200 combined. Not counting interest accruing at 19% on 2 of the 3. She sat with that number for a long time. Then the business accounts. Webb & Associates had a revolving line of credit with a small business bank on Route 9, $85,000 drawn down to within $6,000 of the limit, the kind of number that means a business is living payment to payment and hoping the next invoice comes through before the one behind it catches up. The payment history showed 3 late fees in the past year. She told me all of this on a Saturday morning phone call, the day after my call with Marcus. It was early, not yet 8, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who hadn't slept and had stopped pretending they might. "Mom," she said when I answered. Can I come over? Of course, I said. Come now. She arrived 40 minutes later with both children in the back seat, which surprised me, and with the expression of someone who has been crying for a while and has run out of tears but not out of the feeling behind them. I got them inside, got the kids settled with Coco and the puzzle cabinet in the living room. James immediately went for the 500-piece dinosaur one. Lily chose a 1,000-piece map of the world, and then I made coffee, and Claire and I sat at my kitchen table the way we'd sat at kitchen tables throughout her whole life, and she told me everything. The $41,000 in credit card debt. The $85,000 business line. The BMW that cost $1,200 a month on a lease Marcus had taken out without discussing it with her because he'd needed the car for client meetings, and the optics, he'd said, mattered. The country club membership he'd been paying and then quietly stopped paying 6 months ago after moving the dues to a credit card and then not paying that either. The email from their accountant in September, flagged unread in Marcus's email, that she'd found on his laptop when he left it open on the counter. A note saying the Q3 numbers were concerning and they should meet before the end of the fiscal year. Claire laid all of this out across my kitchen table with the flat voice of someone doing inventory after a flood. Not dramatic, not accusatory, just methodical, the way she got when she was absorbing something large and needed to say it in small pieces before it became real. I listened without interrupting. I made more coffee. I kept my face neutral, not because I wasn't feeling things but because Claire didn't need me to perform my reactions. She needed someone to hear her. When she finished, she wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and looked at the table. I didn't know, she said. I swear to you, Mom, I didn't know most of it. I believe you, I said. I knew things weren't great. He'd said a few times that the business was in a slow season, that certain clients had delayed payments. But I thought, she stopped. I thought we were fine. He always seemed fine. He always acted like everything was under control. That's a particular skill of his, I said carefully. She looked up at me. You knew. I didn't know the numbers, I said. Harold suspected something years ago, that Marcus built a lot of his presentation out of effort rather than substance. But I didn't know the specifics. I just knew not to tell him mine. Something moved across her face, a recognition and a grief combined. That's why you never told us how much Dad left. That's why. She was quiet for a moment. Through the doorway, I could hear James narrating the dinosaur puzzle to himself under his breath, a running commentary on the Cretaceous period that was entirely his own invention. Lily was working on the map in her particular focused silence. He knew you had money, Claire said. Not the exact amount, but he knew. He talked about it sometimes. Said it was good that you were comfortable, that we wouldn't have to worry about you in your later years. He said it like it was a relief to him, like he'd been thinking about it. I know, I said. She looked at me again. How long have you known that? I've known he was paying attention to it, I said. Since the beginning, probably. That's what Harold meant about people who receive generosity as their right. They're always doing some version of the arithmetic. Claire put her face in her hands. Not crying, just covering herself for a moment. The way children do when they want a brief darkness to think in. When she lowered her hands, her expression was something I hadn't seen in a long time. Not anger and not sorrow, but something harder and cleaner than both. Clarity. What do I do? She asked. I can't answer that, I said. That's your marriage and your family and your decision. What I can tell you is that you're not as powerless as this week has made you feel. You have a job you're good at. You have skills. You have a mother with a perfectly good guest room. And you have 2 children who are going to be all right no matter what you decide, because they have people who love them. She reached across the table and took my hand, and we sat like that for a while without speaking, listening to James explain why the Pachycephalosaurus had the hardest head of any dinosaur, which was apparently a fact he'd confirmed through extensive personal research. The weeks between that Saturday morning and Thanksgiving were strange ones. Marcus didn't call me again after our Friday night conversation. He went quiet in the way people go quiet when they're regrouping, and I recognized the quality of that silence as strategic rather than resolved. He would come back with something different. I didn't know when or what, but the absence of noise was not the same as peace. Claire called every few days. Our conversations had changed in register, more direct, less careful, as though the events of the past week had cleared something that had been sitting in the air between us for years. She was going through the finances properly now, with the same methodical determination she'd shown at my kitchen table, understanding for the first time the full shape of what had been built and on what it had been built. She didn't tell me everything, which was appropriate. These were her decisions to reach in her own time. Marcus made his first real move on the Monday before Thanksgiving. He texted me, not called, a long message that opened with "I've been doing a lot of thinking," and proceeded through several paragraphs that I'll summarize here because reading the full thing was an exercise in patience. He said he understood he'd hurt me. He said the Thanksgiving decision had been a mistake made in a difficult season and he regretted it. He said he loved his family and wanted nothing more than for all of them to be together. And then at the end he said, "I know the kids would really love to talk to you. Would it be okay if they called?" I sat with that message for an hour before responding. The ask was reasonable on its face, which is what made it complicated. Of course Lily and James could call me. They were my grandchildren. They could call me anytime they wanted, and they knew that, and Lily in particular used that knowledge freely. But what Marcus was doing was using the children as a bridge back to a conversation I had made clear I wasn't ready to have, and using them in a way they wouldn't understand they were being used. There is a kind of manipulation that is particularly difficult to name and resist because it wraps itself in something real and good. The children did love me and did want to talk to me. That part was true. But the request wasn't really about what Lily and James wanted. It was about Marcus needing the conversation to continue, needing to keep a line open, needing to know where things stood so he could calculate his next move. He'd been calculating since the beginning. This was just the most recent calculation. I texted back, "The kids are always welcome to call me, Marcus. They don't need your permission for that, and they know it." He didn't respond. Lily called that same evening. I could tell from the first 3 words, "Grandma, hi, are you okay?" that she had been primed for the call and had then made it entirely her own, which is the kind of thing Lily does. She'd been told to call. She decided to mean it. We talked for 40 minutes. She told me about a history project on the Byzantine Empire that she was more interested in than she'd expected to be. She told me James had lost his second tooth and was lobbying for a higher tooth fairy rate on the grounds of inflation, which she found both irritating and impressive. She told me she'd asked her parents if she could spend part of the Christmas break with me, and she said this with a careful neutrality that told me she understood it was a loaded question in the current household atmosphere. "I'd love that," I told her. "We'll figure it out. Dad said he'd have to think about it," she said. I noted this and said nothing about it. There was a particular art to these conversations with Lily, the art of being honest about what mattered without burdening her with what was too large for her age to carry. She was 12, which meant she already understood more than she was supposed to and less than she would need to. My job was to be available to what she brought without adding to the weight of it. "Grandma," she said near the end of the call, "is everything going to be okay?" I thought about what to say. Lily deserved honesty and also protection, and finding the line between those two things in a single answer is the kind of problem that has no clean solution. "Everything is going to change," I said. "Change isn't the same as not okay." She was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like something Grandpa Harold would say." "He probably did say it," I said. "He was usually right." She laughed, soft and short, and then said she had to go do homework, and we said goodbye, and I sat in my chair with the phone in my lap and felt the particular full sadness of loving someone you can't fully protect and wouldn't want to even if you could, because the attempt to fully protect people from difficulty is just another way of not trusting them with their own lives. Thanksgiving itself came on a Thursday that was gray and cold, the first real cold of the season, the kind that settles in the bones if you stand outside too long. I had dinner with Helen. We made a proper meal, not a scaled-down version but the real thing. A 12-pound breast roast since there were only 2 of us, stuffing from scratch, cranberry sauce made the way my mother made it, 2 kinds of pie. We sat at my dining room table with good plates and real napkins and a candle in the middle, and we talked for 3 hours about books and gardens and our respective children and the nature of family and what happens to friendship when you're both old enough to have lost people. It was one of the best Thanksgivings I could remember. I had thought, in the days leading up to it, that it might be painful. 49 Thanksgivings spent around a table with family, all of them particular and vivid in their own way. The year Claire was 4 and pulled the tablecloth off the table trying to stand up. The year Harold's parents both came and his father told the same 3 stories 4 times each, and Harold caught my eye across the table with a look of fond resignation. The last Thanksgiving before Harold got sick, which I'd had no way of knowing was the last. So I'd complained about the parking at the grocery store and not paid enough attention to the good thing while it was happening. I had thought being alone on this particular Thursday would feel like falling off the edge of something. It didn't. It felt like standing on solid ground and looking at the horizon. Helen raised her glass at some point in the early afternoon and said, "To absent friends." And I raised mine and thought about Harold and about what he would have said about all of this, and I decided he would have said, "You did the right thing, Ruth." Then he would have asked if there was more pie. There was more pie. At some point in the early afternoon, while the roast was resting, Helen asked if I'd heard from Claire that day. "She texted this morning," I said. "Happy Thanksgiving." She sounded like someone sending a text during an event. "How are things between them?" "She hasn't decided anything yet," I said. "She's still in the part where you're gathering information before you know what to do with it." Helen nodded. "And Marcus's family is there." "All of them," I said. "His parents, his brother and Shelley, the kids from Derek's first marriage who are teenagers now and have opinions about everything." "A full house," Helen said. "A full house," I agreed. "If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." What I learned later from Claire was that the full house that Thanksgiving had not been the relaxed family gathering Marcus had promised her when he'd pitched the idea of excluding me. His parents arrived with the particular energy of people who have been told certain things and are arriving with prepared opinions. His mother, Barbara, a woman I had met perhaps a dozen times over the years and whom I had never fully trusted, made a comment to Claire in the kitchen while the men watched football and the children scattered through the house. She said it while handing Claire a serving dish, casually, in the tone of someone passing along something self-evident. "Marcus told us about the business difficulties," Barbara said. "We think you two need to be smart about Ruth's situation going forward. It would be irresponsible not to think ahead." Claire told me this with a flatness in her voice that was worse than anger, the sound of something going cold. She said, "Ruth's situation," I said. "Like you were a resource to be managed," Claire said. "A line item." And Marcus told them. He told his parents about the cruise cancellation. He told them everything. His version of everything. The difficult mother-in-law who was punishing the family over a misunderstanding. The generous thing he and I had done by including you all these years. The money you apparently have that he'd been expecting would come back into the family eventually. Those were Marcus's words to his parents. Come back into the family eventually. As if my money were a loan extended in his direction, patiently awaiting its return. Claire said that for the rest of that Thanksgiving dinner, she'd sat at the table with the Webb family around her, and felt as though she were looking at a photograph of someone else's life. She ate her food and answered questions and passed the cranberry sauce and all the while thought about the folder in the kitchen desk, about the numbers she'd read the week before, about me sitting alone at my table on the other side of town with 12 pounds of cranberries I hadn't needed. She told me that at some point during the meal Marcus's father had started talking about estate planning, how important it was to get things in order, how he and Barbara had recently updated their trust, how families needed to think ahead about these things rather than leave them to chance. He said it in the abstract, the way people say things in the abstract when they've been briefed about a specific situation. Marcus caught her eye across the table, a quick look she hadn't known how to read in the moment but understood later, the look of a man checking whether the audience is receiving the message as intended. "It was a performance," she told me. "I didn't see it as a performance while I was sitting in it, but looking back, the whole dinner was a performance. That's when I knew," she told me. "Not what I was going to do, but that something had to change." The day after Thanksgiving, a Friday, I was sitting in my living room with a book. I wasn't really reading when the call came from Robert Finch. I had not spoken to Robert since the second anniversary of Harold's death, almost a year ago, when he'd called simply to say he was thinking of me. We talked for 20 minutes about Harold, about the years when they'd been young men with young families and the world had felt both enormous and manageable, and then we'd said goodbye and I'd gone back to whatever I'd been doing, and the call had settled in me as a good thing, the kind of thing that fills a small hole you didn't know you had. This call had a different quality from the first hello. "Ruth," he said, after we'd exchanged the ordinary greetings, "I'm going to get to the point because you deserve that. Something came to my attention last week that I think you need to know about." I sat down. Someone made inquiries about you, he said. About Harold's estate. About the settlement from the acquisition. I won't go into how I came to know this, but a contact of mine was asked some questions, and when he described the person asking, I had a fairly clear picture of who it was. I was very still. He gave a name, Robert said. Marcus Webb. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the snow that had started the previous week was on the ground still, thin and persistent. Harold's bird feeder had 2 sparrows on it and nothing else. When? I asked. About 10 days ago, Robert said. Before Thanksgiving. He was asking about the structure of the settlement, whether it was in your name directly or in a trust, whether there were other assets from the partnership that hadn't yet been distributed. He paused. Ruth, he was asking the kind of questions someone asks when they're trying to figure out the size of an estate and the best way to access it. He hadn't been waiting for me to make decisions. He'd been actively investigating. Before the Thanksgiving call, before the cruise cancellation, before the confrontation that had changed everything, Marcus had been making inquiries about my money through channels he thought I would never reach. He had probably been doing it longer than 10 days. The 10 days were simply the ones that had surfaced. He had no way to know you and I were connected, Robert said, as if reading my thought. He was betting on the assumption that Harold's business affairs were a closed book, and that no one who knew the details would also know you personally. He was wrong about that, I said. He was, Robert said. Harold had a lot of friends, Ruth, and we look out for each other's people. You're his people. After we said goodbye, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The snow outside, the bird feeder, the quiet house. Harold's careful work over a lifetime, sitting in accounts that were protected and secure. And Marcus Webb, 11 years of warmth and patience, making phone calls before Thanksgiving to strangers who knew Harold's business, trying to understand the size of what he'd been positioning himself to inherit. The email had been in the trash folder of their shared computer, emptied by Marcus but recovered by Claire when she took the laptop to a technician friend of hers who specializes in data recovery, a visit she'd made on her own initiative after finding the business bank letters. The technician had pulled several months of deleted email. Claire had gone through it looking for financial correspondence and had found most of what she was looking for, and also buried in an exchange between Marcus and his brother Derek from 8 months ago, something she hadn't been looking for. Derek had written first. How are things? Heard the business had a rough quarter. Marcus had responded, getting through it. The bigger picture is fine. Mom has more than she's ever let on. Dad's life insurance alone was probably substantial, and there's apparently some investment thing from his old business partner that she's never been specific about. I've been making sure we stay close. When she starts making decisions about the estate, I want us to be positioned well. Derek had written back, smart. Has she said anything specific? Marcus. Not yet. She's cagey about it. But she's old and she's alone and she genuinely loves Claire and the kids. It'll come out eventually. Just have to be patient and keep things warm. Old and alone. Just have to be patient and keep things warm. Claire forwarded it with those 3 words above it. I found this. I read it twice, sitting at my kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon in late November. The garden outside the window gone gray and bare for the season. Harold's bird feeder swaying slightly in the wind. I read it and then I set the phone down and sat with my hands in my lap for a long time. I had known, in a general way, that Marcus was paying attention to my financial situation. I had known, in the way Harold had warned me to know, that his generosity had a calculus underneath it, and that the calculus had a number at the end. But seeing it written in his own words with that particular clinical arithmetic, keep things warm, position well, patient, that was different from knowing it in the abstract. What I felt sitting there was something I want to describe accurately because it was not what you might expect. It wasn't devastation. It was something closer to the sensation of having suspected a diagnosis for a long time, and then receiving the confirmation in plain language. Not the shock of something new, but the heavy settling of something finally stated outright. I was old and alone, according to Marcus. I was in a state to be positioned around. I thought about every dinner I'd cooked, every check I'd written, every time I'd answered the phone on the second ring without thinking, every time I'd swallowed an indignity to keep the peace and told myself it was what family did, what mothers did, what women of my generation did. All of it, viewed through the lens of those words, looked like something other than what I'd believed it to be. Not family. Not even a real relationship. An approach. A long game. A deliberate cultivation of proximity to money that had taken 11 years and considerable patience to build. He had called me cagey. Old and cagey. As if my caution about discussing my finances was an obstacle to be managed rather than a reasonable decision made by a person who had every right to keep her own affairs private. I was old and alone according to Marcus. I was in a state to be positioned around. Called Claire that evening. "I got what you sent," I said. "Mom." Her voice was raw. "I'm so sorry." "You don't have anything to be sorry for," I said. "You didn't write it." "I should have seen it. I should have seen him." "Claire," I said gently, "people who are very good at being patient and keeping things warm are hard to see clearly when you're the one they're warming." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to talk to Patricia," I said. "And I'm going to think carefully. And then I'm going to do what makes sense." "He doesn't know I found it," she said. "He doesn't know about the data recovery. He thinks those emails are gone." "Good," I said. "Let's keep it that way for now." "Mom, what are we doing? What are we doing?" The we of it was not lost on me. Claire, who had spent 11 years navigating the space between her husband and her mother, was now standing clearly on one side of a line she'd been avoiding for a long time. I heard it in the way she said we. Something had shifted. "We're doing what Harold would have done," I said. "We're paying attention. And then we're acting on what we've seen." I did not tell Claire about Robert Finch's call or what he had shared with me. I wanted to understand the complete shape of what we were dealing with before adding to what Claire was already carrying. And I was still waiting to see Patricia. Some information changes the decisions available to you, and I wanted to understand the structure before I started talking about it with anyone else. In the days that followed the email, Marcus continued his campaign of careful warmth, apparently unaware of how much had shifted beneath the surface of the household he was trying to manage. He brought Claire flowers on a Friday evening, something he hadn't done in years. He suggested a date night, said he'd made reservations somewhere nice. He was attentive to the children in the public, visible way of someone who has decided to demonstrate something. Claire told me this on a phone call, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who has been watching a performance and is too tired to pretend she can't see the stage machinery. "He knows something is wrong," she told me. "He doesn't know exactly what I know, but he can feel the temperature changing." "What are you telling him?" "That I'm tired and stressed and processing things," she said. "Which is true." "That'll do for now," I said. What I was doing in those days, while I waited to see Patricia and while Marcus maintained his campaign of warmth and while Claire moved through her house with new eyes reading things she'd been looking at for years without seeing, was something I'd spent a long time not being good at. I was letting things be. I was not rushing to resolve or smooth or accommodate. I was sitting with the information and letting it tell me what it needed to tell me before I decided what to do with it. Harold used to say that most bad decisions happen when people act before the ground has stopped moving. He said this specifically about engineering, about the importance of letting a structure fully settle before you load it. I thought about that in those last days of November, moving through my quiet house, tending to ordinary things, waiting for the ground to stop moving. I worked my usual shifts at the library on Tuesday and Wednesday of that week. I shelved returns and helped a woman find a series of cozy mysteries she'd been looking for, and explained the digital catalog to an elderly man who was new to the library and slightly suspicious of computers. These were small things. They were also, in their way, essential. The ordinary work of paying attention to someone who needs help, of making someone feel welcome in a place, of doing a job with care because the job matters even when no one is watching. I'd spent 34 years believing that. I thought about Marcus while I shelved books, which was not what I wanted to be thinking about while shelving books, but the thought came anyway. I thought about the word positioning. How clinical it was. How it described a relationship the way you might describe a piece on a game board. When she starts making decisions about the estate, I want us to be positioned well. I thought about what the opposite of positioning looked like. The opposite of positioning was just showing up. Just being present. Just caring about someone because they were worth caring about and not because of what the caring might eventually return to you. I had done that my whole life, with my students when I was younger and then with library patrons and with Harold and with Claire and with Lily and James. It had never occurred to me to calculate a return. It had simply been what I did because it was who I was. Marcus had looked at who I was and seen an opportunity. That was his failure, not mine. What I was not going to do, in those days of waiting, was let his failure harden me into something I wasn't. I was not going to become the kind of person who measures generosity before giving it, who calculates love, who keeps score and adjusts behavior based on the balance. That would be giving him something he had no right to take, which was my character. He could lose a great deal in the weeks to come. He was not going to lose me that. On my Wednesday shift, a little girl came in with her father to return a stack of picture books. She was maybe 4 years old, the age where everything is still slightly too large for your body, and she was carrying the books with the concentrated effort of someone who has been given an important task. When she set them on the return desk, all 5 of them, she looked up at me with enormous seriousness and said, "These were all very good." "All of them," I said. "All of them," she confirmed. Her father laughed, a little embarrassed, and said she'd been reading them on repeat for 2 weeks. "I'm glad," I told her. "Those are some of my favorites too." She considered this with great solemnity and then said, "You can borrow them back if you want." She was entirely serious. I thanked her and told her I'd keep that in mind. They went to choose new books, her small hand in her father's large one, and I stood at the return desk for a moment with the stack of picture books in front of me and thought, this is what I'm fighting for. Not the money. Not the vindication. This. The ordinary human exchange. The child who wants to share what she loves. The woman behind the desk who loves it too. That was enough. That had always been enough. On the first Saturday of December, Claire came to see me alone. No children, no Marcus. She arrived at 10 in the morning with 2 coffees from the cafe downtown, the same ones Harold used to get us on Saturday mornings when he went for the paper, and she let herself in with the key she'd had since the year Harold died, and she sat at my kitchen table and looked around my house with the particular expression of someone who is seeing a place they know very well with new eyes. "You're happy here," she said. "Not a question." "I'm at home here," I said. "That's not always the same thing, but in this case it is." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I've been thinking about what I want to say to you and I keep starting over because I don't know where to begin." "Begin wherever you are," I said. She took a breath. "I think I've been afraid of Marcus for a long time. Not afraid of him doing anything. Afraid of his disapproval. Afraid of his version of things becoming the only version in the room. He's very good at that. Making his perspective feel like the reasonable one and everyone else's feel like a reaction." She paused. I learned to calibrate myself to avoid the friction. I didn't realize how far that had gone until you canceled the cruise and he was furious and I sat there watching him be furious and thought, whose side am I on? I said nothing, waiting. "I'm on your side, Mom," she said. "I should have said that weeks ago. I'm saying it now." I looked at my daughter across the kitchen table. This woman I had raised with everything I had, who had gotten lost for a while inside someone else's story and was finding her way back. I felt the complicated texture of loving a child, the relief and the grief and the love itself, which is larger than either. "I know," I said. "I've always known. I don't know what I'm going to do about my marriage," she said. "I'm not ready to make that decision yet. But I know I'm done managing the gap between you. If Marcus doesn't want you at Thanksgiving, then I want to be somewhere that does." "Claire, I mean it. The kids and I are coming here for Christmas. All of it. Tree dinner, the whole thing. I've already told him." "How did that go?" She considered. "He called it an overreaction. He said I was letting you manipulate me. He said if I didn't have a mother who stirred things up, none of this would be happening." "And you said?" She almost smiled. I said, "I think what you mean is that none of this would be visible." I sat with that for a moment. "That's a very precise thing to say." "I've had weeks to think about the right words," she said. We sat together in my kitchen for the rest of that morning, talking and not talking, the way mothers and daughters do when they've gotten back to something real after spending time away from it. I made eggs. She refilled the coffee. Outside, the first real snow of the season started, small and tentative, just enough to cover the ground. She told me that Lily had asked her directly, that same week, whether Grandma Ruth was going to be at Christmas. Claire said she'd told her yes. Lily had said, good, with a quiet satisfaction that required no elaboration. Then she'd gone back to her homework. That was Lily. She didn't make speeches about things that mattered to her, she just made clear that they mattered. She's going to be all right, I said to Claire. Both of them are. They're going to be all right because you're going to be all right. I don't feel all right, Claire said. You don't have to feel it yet, I said. You just have to keep going until the feeling catches up. She looked at me across the table. Is that what you did after Dad died? More or less, I said. You keep doing the ordinary things. You make the coffee and you tend the garden and you go to work and you have dinner with Helen on Thursdays. And one day you realize you're not just going through the motions anymore. You're actually there. She nodded slowly. How long does it take? Different for everyone, I said. But it takes less time when you stop pretending you're already there. I had not yet called Patricia. That call was coming. I'd been waiting to understand the shape of things before I started making moves, which is what Harold had always done. Gather information, understand the structure, then act with intention rather than reaction. But there was one more thing I was waiting to understand, and it arrived on a Tuesday evening 12 days before Christmas, in the form of a phone call from a number I recognized immediately. Robert Finch had been Harold's closest friend for 40 years. He was 73, still sharp, still working part-time at the small investment firm he built from nothing in the 1990s. He'd called me twice in the 3 years since Harold died. Once right after the death and once at the 1-year mark, both times simply to say he was thinking of me and that Harold had been the best man he'd ever known. I'd always meant to call him more and hadn't, the way you don't do the things you mean to do. This time he was calling for a different reason. Ruth, he said, after we'd exchanged the ordinary greetings, I'm going to get to the point because you deserve that. Something came to my attention last week that I think you need to know about. I sat down. Someone made inquiries about you, he said. About Harold's estate. About the settlement from the acquisition. I won't go into how I came to know this, but a contact of mine was asked some questions, and when he described the person asking, I had a fairly clear picture of who it was. I was very still. He gave a name, Robert said. Marcus Webb. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the snow that had started the week before was on the ground still, thin and persistent. Harold's bird feeder had 2 sparrows on it and nothing else. When? I asked. About 10 days ago, Robert said. Before Thanksgiving. He was asking about the structure of the settlement, whether it was in your name directly or in a trust, whether there were other assets from the partnership that hadn't yet been distributed. He paused. Ruth, he was asking the kind of questions someone asks when they're trying to figure out the size of an estate and how to access it. I thought about the email. Keep things warm. When she starts making decisions about the estate, I want us to be positioned well. He hadn't been waiting for me to make decisions. He'd been actively investigating. Thank you for calling, Robert, I said. Harold would have called me by now if the positions were reversed, he said. I owed him that much. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time in the early December dark. The snow outside, Harold's bird feeder with its 2 sparrows, the quiet of a house where someone has lived for a long time and knows each corner of. I had all the information I needed now. Not all the information about what was going to happen next because that was still unfolding and would continue to unfold in ways I couldn't fully anticipate. But all the information about what was real, about what Marcus had been doing, about the foundation on which he'd built his 11 years of practiced warmth and carefully managed patience. I picked up my phone and called Patricia. She answered on the second ring. Ruth, she said. I was wondering when I'd hear from you. I need to come in, I said. There are some things I need to tell you, and then I need your help figuring out what to do with them. Can you come Monday? I'll be there, I said. Bring everything, she said. Whatever you have. Written communications, your documentation of events, everything Robert told you. We'll go through it together and figure out what we're dealing with. Is it serious? She paused for a moment, the particular pause of a lawyer choosing her words carefully. What you've described, the sustained interest in your financial situation, the inquiries through third parties, the documented statements about positioning for the estate, those are things that need professional eyes on them. I want to understand the full picture before I characterize it. But I'll say this. Your late husband's decision to set up the trust the way he did was sound. You're protected in ways that matter. Whatever Marcus hoped to access or influence, The structure makes it significantly harder than he likely realized. Harold made sure things held up, I said. He really did, Patricia said. See you Monday. I set the phone down on the table and looked out at the garden for a long time. The bare branches of the rosebushes I'd planted the summer Harold built the bird feeder. The frozen ground that would come back in spring the way it always did. The particular kind of persisting that happens when something has roots deep enough to survive a hard season. I thought about the first time I'd met Marcus. The 45 minutes late and the practiced apology. The questions about Harold's engineering work, so specific and intelligent and designed to make me feel seen. The way he'd said Mom. I thought about the years since, the dinners and the family trips and the 11 Christmases and the checks and the bird feeder and the water heater and the flute lessons, and I thought, he was always paying attention. The attention just wasn't the kind I believed it was. What I didn't feel, sitting there, was what I might have expected to feel. The particular shame of having been fooled. I have known people who were swindled by someone they loved and who afterward carried the shame of the deception as though it were their failure rather than the deceiver's. As though being trusting were the same as being stupid. As though a person who gives generously to their family is somehow to blame when the generosity is exploited. I didn't feel that shame. I felt something much cleaner. I'd given what I'd given because I am who I am, and who I am is someone who takes care of people. Marcus had mistaken that for weakness, for leverage, for an opportunity. The mistake was his. The character was mine. What was coming next was not going to be simple. It was not going to be a clean resolution that arrived in a single conversation and left everything tidy afterward. There would be difficult meetings and harder truths and a marriage that was going to have to be examined in full daylight by two people who had been avoiding that examination for different reasons. There would be a man who had made very deliberate choices, finding out that those choices had consequences he hadn't accounted for. That the woman he'd been managing and measuring and patiently warming had been watching, and paying attention, and talking to people he hadn't known she was talking to. There would also, and this mattered to me as much as anything, be a Christmas. Claire and the children coming here. A tree in my living room, which I hadn't put up since Harold died because putting up a tree alone seemed like grief performed for an empty house. Lily helping me with the ornaments, including the old ones from when Claire was young, the ones with faded photographs and homemade construction paper decorations that I'd kept through 40 years of Decembers because some things are not replaceable. James eating more sugar cookies than was reasonable, and then falling asleep on the couch with the look of someone entirely satisfied with their choices. Claire sitting across the table from me in the kitchen, her hands around a coffee mug, talking without careful management for the first time in years. That was what I was also building toward. Not only the difficult part, not only the confrontation and the exposure and whatever legal and practical reckoning was coming for Marcus. The other thing too. The part on the other side of the difficult part, where what was real could surface and be recognized and lived in. Harold had always said that the hard work of getting somewhere is the price you pay for being there. You don't get to skip the distance. I was Ruth Calloway. I had $3.5 million and a lawyer I trusted and a daughter who had said, "At last, I'm on your side, Mom," and a granddaughter who already knew, in the way that certain children know things before they can put words to them, that her grandmother was someone worth standing beside. I was not old and alone. I was exactly where I needed to be, and I was ready for what came next. Patricia Higgins had been a practicing attorney for 37 years, and in that time she had developed the specific quality of attention that comes from 3 decades of listening to people describe situations they had spent considerable effort not seeing clearly until they had no other choice. She sat across her desk from me on that Monday morning in December and listened to everything. The Thanksgiving call, Lily's screenshot, the cruise cancellation, the financial folder Claire had opened, the email Marcus had sent his brother Derek, and finally what Robert Finch had told me on that Friday afternoon after the holiday. She took notes on a yellow legal pad in handwriting that was quick and precise, occasionally asking a clarifying question. When I had finished, she put down her pen and looked at me with the expression I'd learned to recognize over 3 years of working with her, as the one she wore when she had formed an opinion and was deciding how much of it to say. "Ruth," she said, "I'm going to tell you what I see and then I'm going to tell you what I think we should do." "Please," I said. What Marcus did constitutes, at minimum, attempted financial exploitation of an elder under Connecticut General Statute. The sustained effort to gather information about your assets, the documented statement of intent to position himself to access your estate, the inquiries made through third parties about the structure of your finances, These aren't the actions of a well-meaning son-in-law who was being imprudent. They're a pattern. They're deliberate, documented, and in some respects they've been going on for years. The financial contributions you've described, viewed in the context of the email, suggest that the encouragement of your generosity was partly a calculated strategy. He was building goodwill he intended to convert into access. I sat with the phrase, convert into access. That was the clinical version of what had happened at my kitchen table and on my phone and at every dinner I'd hosted and every check I'd written for 11 years. Convert into access. Harold had seen it from the beginning. He'd just been too decent to say it plainly, and I had been too determined to believe the best of people to hear what he was telling me. However, Patricia continued, and her voice shifted slightly, the trust structure Harold put in place, and the additional security measures we implemented 3 years ago, mean that you are fully protected. There is nothing Marcus can do to access your assets without your explicit, documented consent. No power of attorney he could forge or pressure you into, no inheritance claim, no spousal right through Claire, nothing. Your estate is airtight. Harold made sure things held up. Those words again. I had told her that phrase once years ago, what Harold had said when Lily asked him what he did for work. She had remembered it. I found I couldn't speak for a moment. Now, Patricia said, you have several options. You can file a formal complaint with Adult Protective Services, which would create an official record and potentially result in a criminal investigation. You can pursue a civil action based on the documented pattern of attempted exploitation. Or you can do neither of those things and simply ensure that the protections in place remain intact, that Marcus understands the consequences of any further action, and that you proceed with your life without giving him any further authority over your peace. Which do you recommend? She considered. I think you should let me write him a letter. A legal letter on firm letterhead which describes what I know and what legal exposure he currently has. Not a threat. A statement of facts and a clear communication that any further attempt to access or influence your financial affairs will result in a formal complaint. It will accomplish everything a criminal complaint would accomplish without the burden and exposure to your family. Claire and the children won't have to testify. It won't become a matter of public record. And frankly, for a man whose business depends on reputation and professional relationships, a letter from an estate attorney explaining his potential criminal liability is a significant enough consequence. I thought about Claire, about Lily and James, about what a formal proceeding would cost all of them in ways that had nothing to do with money. Write the letter, I said. Patricia made a note. There's one more thing I want to address, and I want you to think about it carefully. Your will and trust documents currently leave the bulk of your estate to Claire. They make specific provisions for Lily and James. Marcus, as Claire's spouse, has no direct claim to any of it. But I want to walk through the scenarios with you to make sure the structure still reflects your wishes given everything that's happened. It does, I said. What I have is for Claire and the children. That hasn't changed. Claire's marriage is under significant strain, Patricia said. She wasn't being unkind. She was being precise. If they separate or divorce, the protections around your estate mean that Marcus would have no claim against what you leave Claire. But I want to make sure that's clear to you. It's clear, I said. Whatever Claire decides about her marriage, my money is for her and the children. It was always for them. Harold worked his whole life to make sure there would be something left. Marcus was never the intended recipient. He just spent 11 years trying to make himself look like one. Patricia looked at me over her reading glasses. Something in her expression shifted from professional assessment to something warmer. Patricia closed her legal pad. Then you're in a very strong position, Ruth. You came in here with everything you needed. You've been paying attention. Harold taught me to, I said. She smiled. He was a careful man. He made sure things held up, I said. It's the most important job. I drove home from Patricia's office that Monday morning past the shops and banks and restaurants of Fairview's Main Street, all of them familiar in the way of places you've driven past for 30 years without noticing until you notice them. The hardware store where Harold bought his woodworking supplies. The diner where I used to take Claire on Saturdays when she was small. The library, its brick facade and the small carved owl above the entrance that had been there since before I'd started working there. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes before going inside. The bird feeder in the backyard, visible from the driveway, was getting busy with late-season visitors. 2 nuthatches and a chickadee. Harold had liked nuthatches particularly. He said they were the most sensible birds because they were the only ones practical enough to walk upside down. I went inside and started making soup. In the week and a half between that Monday and Christmas Eve, I cleaned the house with the particular thoroughness you apply when you're preparing for something important, and I put up a Christmas tree for the first time in 3 years. Getting the tree up alone was harder than I'd expected, not physically but emotionally. The stand that Harold always assembled, the lights he always strung first while I handed them out in even loops, the ornaments we'd accumulated over 40 years of marriage and the ornaments from my own childhood that my mother had passed to me when she got older and couldn't manage the climbing up and down of putting them away, all of it had a texture that was his as much as mine. I sat on the floor next to the tree at one point, holding an ornament that Claire had made when she was 5 years old. A paper circle covered in dried macaroni, painted gold, with her photograph inside and Merry Christmas Mum and Dad written in wobbly letters across the back. She'd carried it home from kindergarten wrapped in a paper towel, so proud of herself. Harold had said it was the finest ornament he'd ever seen and had given it the place of honor at eye level, front and center, every year for 40 years. I held it for a while, sitting on my living room floor, and let myself feel Harold's absence without trying to manage it. He should have been there. He should have been untangling the lights and putting on the Bing Crosby record and making me drink eggnog before I was ready, the way he did every December. He should have been there for everything that had happened in the past year. He would have known what to do, which is to say he would have done exactly what I'd done, because Harold had known who we were to each other and what we stood for, and he'd made sure things held up. I put the macaroni ornament on the tree at eye level, front and center. Same as always. Lily called 2 days before Christmas to report that she had made a list of activities for the visit, and it included making cookies, watching 3 specific movies, teaching James how to play chess even though he was resistant, and helping Grandma Ruth with whatever she needs because that's just basic. She read the list to me with complete earnestness. I told her it was an excellent list. She told me she was bringing her flute, so she could play the Christmas pieces she'd been learning. Marcus sent me a text on December 23rd. It was a single line. I hope the holiday is peaceful for all of us. I read it once and put my phone down and went back to what I was doing, which was making the dough for the sugar cookies Lily and I were going to cut out and decorate together the next morning. I did not respond. Claire and the children arrived at 4 o'clock on Christmas Eve, which was a Saturday, gray and cold, the kind of Connecticut December day that has no sun and no snow and makes you grateful for whatever warmth exists inside. James arrived first because he ran from the car to the door, which was typical. He had a backpack on his back and a gift bag in each hand, and he announced the moment I opened the door that he had gotten me something really good, but he was not going to tell me what it was until tomorrow. Noted, I said. Come in before you freeze. Lily came next, carrying a duffel bag and her flute case and a poinsettia plant she'd apparently bought with her own money from a stand outside the grocery store. She handed me the poinsettia with the seriousness of someone presenting official credentials. It's red, she said. For Christmas. It's perfect, I said. Claire came last from the car, carrying a bag in each hand and wearing the particular expression I'd come to recognize over the past month as her new default. Not quite sad, not quite tired, but clear. Clearer than she'd been in years. I took one of the bags from her without saying anything and we went inside together. The house felt different with them in it. Not busier exactly, though it was busier. Full in a way that is different from crowded, the way a room sounds different when someone is playing music in it rather than simply filling the air with noise. James had located the ornament box and was examining each ornament with the methodical interest he brought to everything. Lily was in the kitchen with me, measuring flour for cookies and asking about the provenance of each measuring cup with the curiosity of someone who had decided to understand the full history of every object in the room. Grandma, she said, how long have you had this rolling pin? Since before your mother was born, I told her. She turned it over in her hands. It's a really good rolling pin. It is, I agreed. Your great-grandmother gave it to me. She set it down with a new kind of attention. I want to learn how to make the cookies the way you make them. Then watch what I do, I said. We made cookies for 2 hours while James narrated his ornament discoveries from the living room in a one-sided broadcast that neither expected nor required response. Claire sat at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug, and occasionally offered commentary on James's ornament analysis. It was ordinary. It was exactly what ordinary is supposed to be. After the children were asleep, James at 8, Lily at 10, both in the room that had been Claire's when she was growing up, Claire and I sat in the kitchen with the Christmas tree lights visible through the doorway and talked the way we had been talking since mid-November. Without management, without calculation, without the careful editing of a woman deciding what was safe to say. She told me she had told Marcus that morning that she wanted a separation. Not a divorce, not yet, but a separation. Time and space to understand what they were to each other. When the story Marcus had been telling wasn't covering the reality anymore. How did he take it? I asked. About how you'd expect, she said. He said I was being influenced by you. That you'd turned me against him. That I was destroying the family. And I told him the family hadn't been destroyed. It had been revealed. She looked at the table for a moment. That's from you, you know. You said it to him on the phone. None of this would be visible. I've been thinking about it since. I said it because it was true, I said. She looked up. Mom, I need to ask you something. Ask. Did you know? When you canceled the cruise, when you made that decision, did you already know how bad things were? About the debt, about the email, about what he'd been doing. I thought about this. I knew something was wrong, I said. I'd known for years that Marcus's relationship with me had a calculation in it. But I didn't know the specifics. I didn't know about the email or the inquiries to Robert until afterward. When I canceled the cruise, I didn't know any of that. I just knew I wasn't going to fund a vacation for a family that had told me I wasn't part of it. So it wasn't about the money. It was never about the money, I said. It was about what I was willing to accept. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Thank you, she said, for not just accepting it. There was something else she needed to say. I could see it in the way she was sitting, the slight tension of someone who has been holding something and is deciding whether to put it down. I'm sorry, she said. I need you to hear a full apology, not a summary of one. I'm sorry for the years of letting him manage the distance between us. I'm sorry for every time I saw him dismiss you and said nothing. I'm sorry for every check you wrote that I thanked you for but should have questioned. I'm sorry for choosing the path of least resistance so many times that it became a habit I stopped noticing. You were my mother and you were being slowly erased from your own family, and I let it happen because it was easier than the confrontation. I held her hand and was quiet for a moment. Claire, I said. I know what happens to people inside a marriage that has that particular kind of pressure. You calibrate yourself to someone else's expectations by degrees, so small each time that you don't feel the distance accumulating. You don't wake up one morning and decide to let your mother be treated badly. You just keep making the choices that preserve the peace, and one day you look up and the peace has cost everyone something it had no right to cost. I should have looked up sooner, she said. Maybe, I said. But you looked up. That's what matters now. We sat like that for a while, not talking, listening to the quiet of the house, the occasional sound of the furnace, the tree lights making the doorway glow a warm yellow. Christmas morning arrived with thin sunlight and James at 6:15 on the dot, appearing at my bedroom door in his pajamas to report that it was Christmas and the cookies were technically still there, which he said with a significance suggesting it had required considerable restraint. We had breakfast and opened gifts and the kitchen smelled of the cinnamon rolls I'd put in to rise the night before, baked while the children were opening their stockings. James had gotten me, as promised, something really good. A framed drawing he'd made of me and him and a dinosaur labeled Grandma and James and a pterodactyl, which he explained was not technically a dinosaur but was from the same era and deserved inclusion. I told him it was going on the wall in my kitchen and I meant it. Lily had, in addition to the poinsettia, made me a card. On the cover she had drawn the bird feeder in my backyard with a cardinal on it, careful and detailed, recognizably my bird feeder. Inside she had written, "For Grandma Ruth, who always made room at the table, from Lily. Who loves you, obviously." Obviously. She'd chosen that word on purpose. I was certain of it. I was sitting at the kitchen table reading it for the third time when I heard the front door. I had not locked it that morning, which was my habit at Christmas when the door opened frequently for packages and deliveries and neighbors stopping by. The sound of it opening did not immediately alarm me. But something in the quality of the footsteps in the hallway, their particular pace and weight, told me before I turned around. Marcus was standing in the doorway of my kitchen. He was dressed in his usual careful way, good coat, clean shoes, the posture of someone who has decided how this is going to go and is presenting accordingly. But there was something underneath the presentation that I hadn't seen before, or hadn't allowed myself to see. He looked tired. Not tired in a way that sympathy could reach, but tired in the way of someone who has been running a very long game and has begun to sense, without fully admitting it, that the game is not going the way he'd planned. "Marcus," Claire said, from behind me where she'd come in from the living room. Her voice was level but different, the voice of someone who has made a decision and is holding it. "I just want to talk," he said. "Claire, I drove by and I saw the car. I just need 5 minutes." "This is my mother's home," Claire said. "You need to ask her." He looked at me. "Ruth, please. I know things have been difficult. I know I've handled things badly. I just need to talk to you person to person without lawyers or formalities or any of that. Can we do that?" I looked at him for a long moment. 12 years of Thanksgivings and Christmases and birthday dinners and checks written without discussion and phone calls answered on the second ring. 11 years of mom, delivered in a tone that contained none of the word's actual meaning. And underneath all of it, the 8-month-old email. "Old and alone. Just have to be patient and keep things warm." "You can sit down," I said. "But I want you to listen before you say anything else." He sat at my kitchen table, in the chair where Claire had sat on that first Saturday morning in November, where Harold used to sit for his morning coffee, where my mother used to sit when she visited. He sat in that chair and I stood at the counter, and I spoke carefully and without anger. "I know about the email you sent Derek in April," I said. "I know about the inquiries you made before Thanksgiving about Harold's business settlement. I know about the credit cards, the business line, the lease you didn't tell Claire about. I know about what Barbara said at Thanksgiving and what you told your parents about my money." He started to speak. "I'm not finished," I said. "My attorney has reviewed all of it. She's written a letter that will be delivered to you this week that explains, in specific legal terms, the relevant Connecticut statutes about financial exploitation of elders, and the consequences of any further attempt to access or influence my financial affairs. You will receive that letter and you will read it and you will understand that every protection that needs to be in place is in place." He was very still. "I'm not filing a complaint," I said. "I'm not interested in seeing you prosecuted or publicly shamed or financially ruined. You have 2 children who love you, and whatever you are to me, you're their father. I'm protecting myself and my estate, and that's where it ends. But I need you to understand that I know everything, and the people who need to protect me know everything, and what you were hoping for is not going to happen." The silence in my kitchen was complete. Outside, a chickadee landed on the bird feeder and examined the seeds with brief professional interest. Marcus looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He looked at Claire, who was standing in the doorway with her arms folded, watching him with a steadiness that was new and unmistakable. "I didn't think of it as exploitation," he said. His voice had lost the careful modulation of the man who had shown up at my front door. Something simpler was underneath it now. Something that might have been the beginning of honesty, though it had a long distance to travel. "What did you think of it as?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Planning," he said. "I thought of it as planning. Being practical. You're getting older. You have substantial assets. Claire and the kids are going to need those assets someday. I was just making sure we were in the right position when the time came." "You were making sure you were in the right position," I said. "Claire didn't know you were doing it. She didn't know about the debts or the inquiries or the email. She wasn't part of the planning. You were doing it for yourself." He didn't argue with this. "Marcus," I said, and I kept my voice level because I meant what I was about to say and I wanted it to land without anger distorting it. "I am not a resource. I am not a financial vehicle or an estate to position around or a line item in someone else's future plans. I am a person, a specific person with a name and a history and 40 years of choosing carefully how to spend what I had and what I valued. Harold left me that money because he trusted me to make good decisions with it. Not because he wanted it to fund a lifestyle for a man who called his wife's mother old and alone in an email to his brother." Marcus's jaw tightened. He was silent. "I want you to understand one more thing," I said. The money is going to Claire and the children. Whatever happens between you and Claire, whatever the courts decide, whatever lawyers say about marital assets, what I have built and what Harold built is not going to Marcus Webb. That decision was made years ago and it is secure and legal and nothing you do will change it. I'm telling you this not to be unkind but because I want you to stop doing the arithmetic. Stop calculating. There is nothing in this direction for you. He stood up from the table. He straightened his coat. He was still trying, even now, to look like the man who'd arrived with a plan. But the plan was gone and we both knew it. I'm sorry, he said, and it came out very quietly, not performed, not strategic. Just the two words. I don't know what they covered or how much of what had happened he was actually sorry for. I suspect he was mostly sorry it had ended this way. But I received the words for what they were, and let them sit between us without comment. He walked back through my hallway and out the front door. I heard his car start. I heard it back down the driveway. I heard it go. Claire let out a long breath. Are you all right? She asked me. Yes, I said. And I was. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her pajamas, looking between us with the careful observation of a 12-year-old, who has understood that something significant has occurred but is waiting to be told how much of it to absorb. Is everything okay? She asked. Claire looked at me. I looked at Lily. Yes, I said again. Everything is going to be fine. Your dad needed to drop something off. How about we make hot chocolate and you play me those Christmas pieces you've been practicing? She studied my face for a moment with those perceptive eyes that had always seen more than most adults gave her credit for. Then she nodded. I have to warn you, she said. The last one is a little fast and I sometimes mess up the middle section. I'll be the most forgiving audience you've ever had, I said. She went to get her flute. James appeared from wherever he'd been, apparently unmoved by the entire preceding event, and announced that he was ready for more cookies. Claire laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised, the kind you can't manufacture, and put her arm around her son and said, When aren't you ready for cookies? And he said, Never, that's the point. And we all went back to what Christmas was supposed to be. Lily played her Christmas pieces in the living room while the rest of us listened. She was right that the last one had a difficult middle section. She got through it on the second try, and when she finished she looked up at me and I started clapping with the unmistakable enthusiasm of a grandmother who had sat through school recitals and talent shows and waited precisely for this moment, for the piece that came out right on the second try, for the 12-year-old who had worked and kept at it and gotten through the difficult part. James informed her it was very good for someone who was almost a teenager, but would have been more impressive if she could play the Jurassic Park theme. Lily said she would learn the Jurassic Park theme specifically so she could refuse to play it for him. They argued about this cheerfully for 10 minutes. Claire caught my eye across the room and we shared the particular look of people who are watching something they love and know it. I turned 70 on the 14th of January. Helen came over in the morning with a cake she'd baked herself. A lemon pound cake with a lemon glaze, my favorite since the 1980s when I'd first made one for a library staff potluck and had been making it ever since. She put one candle on it, not 70, because she said counting candles was for people who hadn't earned the right to stop counting. We ate cake at the kitchen table at 10 in the morning and I told her everything that had happened over the past 2 months, from the phone call in November to Marcus showing up on Christmas morning to the quiet of Christmas afternoon when he was gone and the house was full of my family again. She listened without interrupting the way she always listened, and when I'd finished she was quiet for a moment. Ruth, she said, how do you feel? I thought about it. Like myself, I said. I feel like myself. I haven't felt like myself in years. She raised her coffee cup. Happy birthday, she said. To feeling like yourself at 70. Patricia sent a card with a handwritten note inside. The estate is fully secured. Everything is as it should be. Harold would be satisfied. Happy birthday, Ruth. I read that note 3 times. Lily and James called in the afternoon to sing to me over the phone, James slightly off-key and entirely unbothered by it, Lily in tune but laughing halfway through at the off-key parts. Claire called after and we talked for an hour about nothing in particular, the library and the garden and what Lily had decided she wanted to do for her school independent study project, which was apparently either ancient Rome or marine biology, and she was still deciding. Nothing important. Nothing dramatic. Just the ordinary conversation of people who are at ease with each other and have time to spare. That evening I sat in my living room alone with a glass of wine and Harold's bird feeder visible through the window in the gray January light, and I thought about being 70 years old, about what it meant to have arrived here, about the path that had wound through a starter apartment in Hartford in 1979, through 34 years at the library reference desk, through Harold's woodworking shop and the Maine coast in August and the bird feeder he'd built the summer before he died, about the years since. The grief, the estate, the trust, the cottage in Willow Creek Estates, the checks written without discussion, the Thanksgiving call, the cardinals on the bird feeder, the cruise that wasn't. About Patricia's letter to Marcus signed and sent, which he had received in the week after Christmas and which had done exactly what Patricia had predicted it would do. About the conversation I'd had with Marcus in my kitchen on Christmas morning, the arithmetic finally stopped, the game finally over. About Harold, who had seen all of this coming in some form, and had made sure the structure held when it needed to. 70. It was a good number. I had earned it and I intended to use it well. The weeks that followed Christmas and my birthday had their own kind of settling, the ground finally stopping its movement the way Harold had described. In late January, Claire and Marcus entered a formal separation agreement. He moved out of the family house into an apartment across town, and Claire went back to work full-time at the dental office, 5 days a week, finding in the return to her own competence something she hadn't known she'd been missing. She told me the first week she was back full-time, she'd driven home at the end of the day and felt tired in the good way, the way of someone who had used their skills rather than spent the day managing an atmosphere. Patricia's letter had arrived as promised in the week after Christmas. Marcus had read it, according to Claire, gone very pale and very quiet, and then called his own attorney. His attorney had advised him, as Patricia had known any competent attorney would, that there was nothing to dispute and everything to lose by pursuing any further action. He had, to his credit, stopped. The campaign of warmth ended entirely. In its place was something more honest, if not comfortable. A man dealing with the consequences of a decade of choices that had come due at once. He was not a monster, and I want to be accurate about that. He was a man who had learned to treat relationships as instruments and who had, for 11 years, treated his mother-in-law as a resource rather than a person. Those were his failures. They had consequences. The consequences arrived on their own schedule, as consequences tend to. His business survived, though reduced. The BMW went back. He drives a Civic now, which Claire told me with the kind of dark humor that only becomes available once you're far enough from something to find it faintly absurd. The country club membership was long gone. 2 of his larger clients departed in the first quarter after the air went out of his professional presentation, when it became clear that boutique and growing had always described ambition rather than reality. What remained was a functional small firm with honest revenue, which was what it had been all along before the performance. The divorce, when Claire finally filed in May, was settled without significant conflict. There was not enough for Marcus to fight over, and he knew it. The settlement was practical and fair, and Claire came through it with the family house, primary custody of the children, and no illusions about who she was and what she was capable of. The illusions had been expensive. The clarity was worth the price. I want to be clear about something because I think clarity matters here. I did not feel triumph when Marcus's circumstances contracted. I had no desire for his suffering. What I felt was something closer to relief. The particular relief of a situation that has been accurately named finally resolving into what it actually was rather than what it had been pretending to be. The performance was over. We were all dealing with the real thing now, whatever that was. Claire told me once in March that she'd asked Marcus directly what he'd been thinking, what he'd actually believed he was doing. He'd said, after a long silence, that he'd told himself it was just planning, being smart about the future, that he'd never intended to actually hurt anyone. She'd said, the people who get hurt are usually the last consideration of the people doing the hurting. He'd had nothing to say to that. Sometimes the right answer to a true thing is silence. James adjusted to the new arrangement with the resilience of a 9-year-old who still had both parents, a grandmother who brought him dinosaur books, and his pterodactyl drawing hung on the kitchen wall where I'd promised it would go. He was fine. Children are often finer than adults expect them to be, when the adults around them are honest. Lily was 12 and understood more than James did and felt more than she showed, which is the particular burden of being the older child in a household that has shifted. She asked me once, on a Saturday in February when we were making soup together in my kitchen, whether I thought her parents might get back together. I told her I didn't know, and that it wasn't my place to guess, but that I knew both of her parents loved her and that she had people around her who would make sure she was all right. She nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she was processing something real rather than just receiving information. "Do you think Dad is a bad person?" she asked. I thought carefully. "I think your dad made some choices that were wrong," I said. "I don't think that makes him a bad person. People are more than their worst choices. What matters is whether they're willing to look at the wrong choices and change." She was quiet for a moment. "Is he changing?" "I don't know yet," I said. "That's still happening." She accepted this. Then she said, "The soup smells really good," and went back to stirring it, and we didn't talk about it again that day, and I thought, she's going to be all right. She has her grandmother's stubbornness and her grandfather's patience and her mother's warmth. She's going to be completely all right. Spring came the way spring comes in Connecticut, argumentatively in fits and starts, a warm week followed by a cold snap, the first green shoots in the garden appearing and then getting snowed on and then appearing again with renewed conviction. I planted the vegetable bed in April and put in the tomatoes in May. Lily came to help me on a Saturday in April and we worked in the garden for 3 hours and she asked me everything she could think of about plants and I told her everything I knew and she said at one point, "I think I want to have a garden someday," with the tone of someone making a private decision out loud. "You will," I said. "You're the kind of person who takes care of things." She looked at me from across the tomato bed. "Is that a compliment?" "It's the best kind of compliment," I said. That summer, in August, Claire and I took the children to the Maine coast. Not the Mediterranean cruise that Marcus had been telling his colleagues about since September. A week at a rental cottage in the same town Harold and I used to go, chosen for its reliability rather than its novelty. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a porch that faced the water. We ate lobster rolls on paper plates and walked the same beach Harold and I had walked 30 years before, and I told the children things about their grandfather that I'd been saving for the right moments, and the right moments kept arriving. James wanted to know what Harold had been like when he was 9. I told him Harold at 9 had been deeply interested in how things worked and had taken apart his mother's kitchen radio to understand the mechanism, and then put it back together imperfectly so the AM stations came in but the FM didn't. James found this hilarious and reported that he understood the impulse completely. Lily wanted to know if Harold had ever been afraid of anything. I told her he'd been afraid of letting people down. That he'd never said so directly, but I'd known him for 40 years and I'd seen the way he went quiet when he felt he'd fallen short of what someone needed, the way he worked harder until he felt he'd made it right. Lily was quiet for a moment after I said this and then said, "He sounds like me," with the careful matter-of-factness of someone who has just recognized themselves in someone they loved. On the last evening we sat on the porch watching the sun go down over the water, all 4 of us, and Lily said, "Grandma, is this what it always looked like?" "Pretty much," I said. "It's really good," she said. "It really is," I agreed. I thought about the Mediterranean cruise. The 14 nights, the 7 ports of call, Dubrovnik and Santorini and Mykonos. I thought about the $82,000 and the deposit and the balance that would have been due December 1st. I thought about Marcus at his golf game, describing the birthday cruise to men who had nodded and thought well of him for having a mother-in-law generous enough to fund such a thing. I thought about Lily on the porch in Maine watching the sun go down over the water, saying it's really good. I thought, this was the right choice. Not because Maine is more beautiful than Santorini, though it has its own beauty, the particular stubborn gray-green beauty of the New England coast that doesn't perform for anyone. Not because the cottage cost less or because proving a point mattered more than the trip, but because the decision to cancel the cruise had been the moment I'd stopped accepting a version of myself that wasn't true. I had been Ruth Calloway my whole life. For a few years I had allowed someone else to write the description. That was over. What I know now at 70, sitting in my kitchen on an ordinary morning with the bird feeder visible through the window and the garden going dormant for the season, is what Harold knew at every age he got to be. That the work of holding things up is patient and unglamorous and mostly invisible to the people who benefit from it. That character, when it's real, doesn't require an audience. That the people who mistake your patience for passivity and your generosity for weakness will eventually be surprised by both, not because you planned it that way but because they were wrong about the math. I still work my 2 afternoons a week at the library. I still have dinner with Helen on Thursdays. I still tend the garden and fill the bird feeder and make the same soup Harold liked when October comes and the air changes. The rocking chair he'd been building for James the morning he died is still in the woodworking shop, half finished, waiting for the right person to complete it. James asked about it again last month and I told him I was thinking about finding a craftsman to finish it, someone who works in the same style Harold worked in, careful and precise, making sure things hold up. I'd like that, James said. He said it the way Harold used to say things that mattered to him. Plainly, without elaboration, trusting the other person to understand the weight of it. Lily is playing the Jurassic Park theme now on her flute. She did learn it, and she does not refuse to play it for James. She told me this was a unilateral decision to be the bigger person. It made me laugh harder than I had in months. Some days laughter is the thing that arrives to tell you that you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Claire has Sunday dinners at my house most weeks, which is where Sunday dinners should happen, in the kitchen that has always known how to hold people. She's rebuilding something, not the marriage she had but something more honest. A life she's chosen with clear eyes, work she's good at, children she's raising with more of herself than she was able to give before. Watching this happen has been one of the unexpected gifts of the past year. You can lose things and find things you didn't know you'd been missing. That's true for all of us. I have my grandchildren every other weekend and sometimes more. James has decided he wants to learn woodworking, which I think Harold would have considered one of the finest possible outcomes of his life. I'm going to make that possible. I'll end here at 70 in my house on half an acre in Fairview, Connecticut, with Harold's bird feeder and my mother's rolling pin and a garden that will come back in spring. With a daughter who found her way back and 2 grandchildren who are going to be extraordinary. With $3.5 million that Harold built carefully over a lifetime and that will go, in time, to the people it was always meant for. On a Saturday in late October, 3 years and 1 month after Harold died in the woodworking shop on a morning I brought him iced tea at 11 o'clock. Lily came over to help me put the garden to bed for the winter. This is what you do with a garden in Connecticut before the first hard frost. You cut back the perennials, turn the soil, cover the beds with straw, take in the planters. It takes an afternoon and it has a particular quality, this work, of doing something with full knowledge that the thing you're tending will be invisible for months and will come back in forms you can't entirely predict. Lily worked beside me without needing instruction, which she hadn't the first time she'd helped with this and which she did now. Cutting back the rose canes at the right height and placing the mulch with care around the base. She'd been gardening since April with real attention, and it showed. At one point she stopped and stood up and looked at the bird feeder. "Do you think about Grandpa Harold a lot?" she asked. "Every day," I said. "Me too," she said. "I think about the things he said. I remember them like quotes. Is that weird?" "That's not weird at all," I said. "That's how people stay with you." She thought about this. "What's the one you think about most?" I looked at the bird feeder, Harold's bird feeder, the nuthatches working their way upside down along the edge of it with their sensible methodical industry. "He said his job was to make sure things hold up," I said. "I think about that one most." She nodded slowly. "He did," she said. "He really did." We went back to work. The garden going dormant around us, the October light going horizontal in the late afternoon. The two of us moving through familiar ground in comfortable quiet. Some of the best times in a life are like that. Unremarkable from the outside, everything from the inside. When we finished, we went inside and I made hot chocolate and we sat at the kitchen table and Lily told me she decided on marine biology for her independent study, which had won out over ancient Rome because she said, there were still things in the ocean nobody had seen yet and she found that preferable to things that had already been thoroughly examined. "Harold would have agreed with you," I said. "Really?" "He always said the work worth doing is the work where the answer isn't known yet," I said. "He said that's what gets you up in the morning." She smiled, the real one, the one that's different from the polite smile and the amused smile and carries Harold in it, that particular quality of delight at something recognized as true. "I'm going to remember that one," she said. "Good," I said. "Now drink your hot chocolate. It's getting cold." With a life that is mine in a house that knows it, and a sense of myself that no one is ever going to take from me again. Harold made sure things held up. So did I. The rocking chair came home on a Saturday in early March, in the back of a pickup truck driven by a man named Frank Dolan who had spent 40 years as a furniture craftsman in Glastonbury and who had, When I described what I was looking for, taken a long look at Harold's unfinished piece and gone very still. "This is good work," he said. "Yes," I said. He was careful about everything. Frank took the chair back to his shop in September. He called twice over the following months with questions, small technical ones about the angle of the back spindles and the height Harold had planned for the seat. I couldn't answer with certainty, so we made the decisions together, and Frank made them the way Harold would have made them, which is to say with enough patience to get them right. When the chair came through my front door in March, James was sitting on the living room floor building something out of blocks. He was 10 now and still narrated his constructions as he worked, a quiet ongoing commentary to himself about structural considerations and aesthetic choices that Harold would have found entirely recognizable. He looked up when Frank carried the chair in. He went very still. "Is that the chair?" he asked. He said it in the voice of a child who already knows the answer and is asking to be allowed to receive it. "That's the chair," I said. He stood up and walked over to it and put his hand on the armrest the way you touch something you're not sure is real. The wood was walnut, finished in the oil Harold had always preferred, and it had the quality of things made slowly and with intention. You could feel it in the weight of it, in the way it didn't move when James pressed against it. "Grandpa Harold started it," James said. "Not a question." "He was making it for you," I said. "James sat in it." He sat in it the way people sit in chairs that were made for them, settling into the fit of it, his feet just reaching the floor, his hands on the armrests that were exactly the right width for a 10-year-old's reach and would be exactly the right width for a grown man's reach in time. Lily, who had come over for Saturday dinner and was standing in the doorway to the kitchen holding a dish towel, said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "He would have loved to see that." "He would have said it came out exactly right," I said. James rocked once, forward and back, testing the motion, and then settled and looked up at the ceiling with the satisfied expression of someone who has received something that was always meant for them and simply took a while to arrive. The room was quiet. The bird feeder swung in the March wind outside. Harold's work in Harold's house, in the hands of Harold's people. That's what holds up. That's what always holds up. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.